Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to welcome you to our latest webinar in our Sphere Compliance series, focusing on 21 NYC RR 500, otherwise known as the New York Cybersecurity Requirements. Today, we'll be focusing on penetration testing, vulnerability management, and application security. My name is George McConaughey, and I'll be your moderator for this afternoon. During today's presentation, we encourage you to send us your questions on this topic, as they will be answered sequentially at the end. Instructions are outlined on this slide. Questions will be answered sequentially. We have a lot of information to share with you today, but to that effect, I would like to introduce Michael Mihalik, Chief Information Security Officer for Sphere Technology Solutions. Mike has over 33 years of risk management experience gained with working from leading property and casualty insurance companies. Prior to joining Sphere Technology Solutions, Michael was the Chief Information Security Officer for ProSafe Specialty Insurance and the Chief Privacy Officer for Tower Insurance Company of New York. Little known unknown fact is that he also participated in the early surveys centering around these regulations, which led to the development of the requirements as you see today. So he brings a very unique perspective when it comes to these regulations, which I'm sure you'll appreciate. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, George. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar. Just a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to be legal advice, and you should consult an attorney for advice regarding your individual situation. So this is our CISO battle cry. If you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. General Sun Tzu, from The Art of War, he was a Chinese military general, a military strategist, and a philosopher. And this has become our battle cry because we follow the same thing. We need to know our weaknesses or our vulnerabilities, and we need to know our threats. So this is the items we're going to cover today: a compliance timeline refresher, application security, vulnerability management, and penetration testing. So with the compliance timeline, we are in our first milestone, September 1st, 2017. We are 114 days out, or 83 business days. And by now, you should be looking at hiring your cybersecurity personnel and chief information security officer, who are both, or a group, are working on your cybersecurity programs, your policies, your incident response plan, as well as your access privileges. In previous webinars, we have covered these items in green, and I encourage you to go out to our website for replays, which is sphereco.com, and go to the news and events area to replay those webinars. So these are the things we have previously covered. Today, we're going to cover penetration testing and vulnerability scanning, as well as application security. So why application security? We need to answer some questions. First, do you have in-house developed applications? And when I talk about in-house, they are being developed within your environment, and that could be done with internal staff or outsourced to a vendor, or you have applications that are installed in your environment. And if you do, then you need to start asking yourself about what are those security processes, and what are we doing around security around those applications. And the scope of this is web applications, web services, mobile applications, third-party components, and even open source components. And what is the process around that to make sure that those systems are actually secure? As you know, there's well over 400 different threats out there against web applications, and that's continuing to grow, and it changes every day. And in addition to that, developers sometimes create backdoors to systems so they can jump into an application and fix it relatively quickly. And it's usually done for testing or development stages. But sometimes those backdoors get migrated into production. And if you don't know they're there, the hacker will find out right away. But if you don't know they're there, you need to remediate that. So how are you determining if these backdoors exist? And finally, open source components. What is the security process around them? Open source components are in the public domain. How are they being tested? And two, how are you supporting those applications? Since they are open source, you need a skill set within your environment to actually work on those components if they fail. What does that mean? From a business perspective, if those components fail and they're no longer available to your website, there may be a business impact in which the application is no longer functioning the way it was originally designed. So you need to make sure you have that in the, capability within the organization, or you have somebody who is capable of supporting that if that needs to be. With application security, there are benefits. The benefits are, one, we're going to reduce the frequency and severity of security incidents. It's much cheaper to reduce risks at the development stage than it is in the production stage, and that's usually in orders of magnitude cost reduction. And it's, also application security provides the benefit of compliance, and it's really good business because, you're out there, you're requesting information to be presented to you, and as a result of that, you have a requirement to protect it. So OWASP puts out the top 10 list. The top 10 list is basically, it's put together by a security or a community of security experts, and they basically talk about their experiences in web applications. So right here is the top 10. There's a lot more, but these are the ones that they typically see across many of the applications or web components. So what does an application security lifecycle look like? First of all, we start with security by design, and that is basically understanding security requirements, making sure we understand what the authority levels need to be within the application, who should have access. We're looking at security architecture, making sure components are placed in the right place. For example, you would not want to put a database into a DMZ. We want to make sure we have secure coding standards. And again, this is kind of guidance to your developers or outsourced vendors to let them know what your expectations are about how we are going to code for those applications. And then we want to make sure we have secure code libraries. These are libraries that you're going to be using. It includes components, and we want to make sure those components are secure. We also want to, the next phase is the testing phase, which is basically we're going to start going through and making sure that we're testing our code. So for example, static analysis occurs during the coding phase, whereas dynamic and static analysis can happen during the testing phase. We want to have, or could have, bug bounty programs. This is where we pay people to find issues with our programs and then notify us, and upon notification we give them some kind of reward or some kind of monetary amount or recognition. We also want to do code reviews. Code reviews are the easiest and best way to find backdoors. And finally, we also want to look at component lifecycle management, which basically is how are we managing our third-party components? Are they at their end of life? How do we upgrade them? And making sure we're referencing them the correct way. When I mean referencing them, I've seen situations where a third-party component was referenced to another site, and it was being used off that site. And as a result of that, when that site actually updated that component, the site that we were using actually failed because it did not agree with the version. The next phase is the remedy stage, which is basically after we've done all our testing, we want to start fixing the issues that were raised. And we're going to do this through patch management or upgrading the components. We might be remediating the code or rewriting some code. And we also will probably install maybe a web application firewall or a runtime protection. That's some of the new things that are occurring where we can make sure that once our code is in production, we're up to snuff. And then finally, we want to govern. All right, govern is about having a software development lifecycle. This is the phases of the development, taking it from requirements to production. And along that path, there's different steps that we have to walk through and make sure we do, for example, the design, the test, and then the remediation, and then getting sign-off from the business that the application actually works the way it should be working. Remember, security is about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So we want to make sure that we're covering the availability component as much as we are covering the confidentiality piece. Application security training, we want to make sure our developers are being trained. Again, we want to, if they don't know what to do, they need to be trained. We got to fill that gap. So they need to understand how to write secure code. So that should be part of their goals and objectives. And finally, from a metrics and reporting standpoint, we want to make sure our process is working correctly. We talked about this in previous webinars, where we want to make sure if we implement a control, we want to make sure the control is working effectively, and metrics and reporting will give us that capability to see that, you know, these controls are in place, and over time we should see our issues kind of decline and disappear. From a vulnerability management standpoint, it's similar to application security in that it's a process. Our scope in this particular case is somewhat different. We're now looking at hardware, devices, firmware, security configurations, and commercial off-the-shelf software, which is basically, it could be Microsoft Office. These are things installed on your desktop or laptops and desktops. Or it could also be your server operating systems, for example, Microsoft Windows, or it could be SQL Server. Those type of things also need to be tested for vulnerabilities. Usually the vendor tests them and kind of gives you indications of what they find. But other software, for example, maybe you have something installed that is not tested, and you would want to be able to do that kind of testing on them. According to the New York Department of Financial Services regulation, it basically says that you have to do biannual vulnerability scans unless you're doing vulnerability scanning real-time, continuous monitoring. So your scanner should be, you know, depending on how you're doing this, be looking at the configurations. It should be looking at products of the end of life. So, for example, Windows XP was at end of life, and the risk there is that those applications no longer get patches applied to them. So any risks that were identified will remain as a risk, and nothing will be put out by the vendor. So you have to have some kind of compensating controls around that. You also want to look at replace technology. Replace technology, in this particular example, I will use switches. Switches were up to 1 gigabit switches, and if you still have 10/100 switches, your communication speeds will be at the least protocol of 10/100, so you're not getting the capabilities that you think you would if you had the 1 gigabit switches. So if you're in a mixed mode situation where between gigabit and 10/100 switches, you're getting the lower protocol. So understanding that within your environment is also important. Identify flaws, and again, this is coming across from your vendors. So if you have a device, say a switch, and somebody is notifying you that there is a flaw within that switch, and you have to update the firmware, that you need to be aware of that and you have to have controls around that. With your vulnerability scanners, there will be false negatives, and that's basically where there's a vulnerability exists in a system or component, but the scanner did not pick it up. And there also is false positives, which is basically a vulnerability does not exist, but you're being notified that one exists. And again, this will be corrected over time as you configure your scanners and you improve their capabilities. But you have to be aware of these because, you know, running the scanner and saying, hey, I had no vulnerabilities might not always be true. You have to do some kind of in-depth analysis. And as always, you will never know about zero-day vulnerabilities. Your scanners won't have that information. So you have to have a little side methodology to make sure that as these zero-day vulnerabilities are discovered, you're reviewing that process to make sure that you don't have that zero-day vulnerability within your environment. And if so, if you have it, what is your compensating controls around that until a patch or a modification comes out? So what is a vulnerability management process? Basically, we start off with assets, and then we've talked about this in a couple other webinars. We need to know what assets we have, because the unknown asset is something we will not be able to know what those vulnerabilities are. So if it's not in our inventory and we don't scan it, we don't know what those vulnerabilities from that asset can be. So we want to make sure we have and track all our assets. And in this particular case, we want to know our hardware, our software. We want to know devices. All that has to be put into our inventory and make sure that we're scanning that entire inventory. Once we scan for the vulnerabilities, we're going to get a listing of risks that we need to, or vulnerabilities that need to be patched or remedied in some shape, or form. And that could, for example, security configurations might be you're turning off services. Once you go through that and you identify which ones are your high risk, you need to then go through the process of testing those changes in configuration, patches, or updates, because the other part, again, is you do not want to impact the business. If you apply a patch or you make a system configuration, there might be an availability issue because the application no longer runs with that change in configuration. And as a result of that, we've taken it from a risk to an actual outage, which is not exactly what we want to accomplish. So we want to test them, make sure they work, and once they are approved, we want to put them into production so that we are remedying the risk and not impacting our availability. So pen testing. The Act also says in this that you do not have to do, you do not have to do pen testing if you have continuous monitoring in place. And I kind of recommend that you do pen testing. As I identified before, your vulnerability scanner will give you false positives and false negatives. And penetration testing is going to actually, kind of measure what your vulnerability scanner is actually doing. It's going to be the way we're going to be able to see if it's correctly configured or not. It's also a realistic way of just make sure you've got your cybersecurity program correctly developed. If a hacker is going to come in and be able to do this, I'd rather we hire a certified ethical hacker and we determine what that looks like before somebody else does. So my recommendation is that you do penetration tests at least annually to make sure that your cybersecurity program and controls are working effectively, that your vulnerability scanner is working correctly, and that your patching processes are working as designed, right? If somebody is not looking at how the patching process is working and that we're getting everything covered, there could be a loophole in your security program, and that's what we want to look for. So when you do penetration testing, you want to define the scope of the pen test. So is it your external network? Is it your internal network? Do you want to include web applications, mobile devices, social engineering? I've added this one because in one circumstance, in my past experience, we tested our help desk, and we acted in the scenario of, hey, I'm offsite and I forgot my password, can you reset it? Well, it wasn't an employee who did it, it was the ethical hacker, and we were able to actually get the account and then be able to steal that person's password or get that person's password and reset it. So now that ethical hacker had that person's account for a period of time. And that's a use case that you would want to look at when you do your testing. You build these use cases or these scenarios to see if it actually can exist. Also, from a wireless standpoint, you want to include wireless in your penetration testing. And again, this is the TJ Maxx example, the TJ Maxx hack. Somebody sat in the parking lot and was able to hack the wireless of TJ Maxx and then be able to breach their systems. So you would want to be able to test that and make sure that is up to snuff as far as controls are concerned. Also, from a segmentation standpoint, because you want to make sure your wireless is not able to get to sensitive information. As I mentioned before, when you do your penetration test, it's almost as if a hack was a real attack was occurring. So you want to check to see if your intrusion protection systems and your intrusion detection systems are actually working. All right. So if the attack is going on and your IPS and your IDS are not telling you that this is going on, there might be some configuration issues with that. In addition to that, if they do work, if your IPS works and your IDS work and the lights are going off, is somebody on the incident response team actually seeing it and doing something about it? Because we're also testing that during the penetration test. And this is the target hack in which the tool actually notified them that there was something going on, but nobody actually did anything about it, and it gave the hacker time to get the data out of the company. So that's why I recommend that we do a penetration test, because we want to test our cybersecurity program from end to end. So what does the pen test process look like? Well, the very first thing you do is you're going to do an initiation, which is you're going to pick your certified ethical hacker. You're going to set up an NDA with him or others, depending on who's going to be involved in this process. You're going to define your scope, whether you want to do all these things we previously mentioned or just some of those things. It's up to the organization how to determine that. And then finally, you want to get permissions. You want to get permissions internally. You want people to sign off on it and know that you're going to be doing this. And you also want to do it from an external standpoint. So if you are working with a hosted service provider and they're hosting your environment, you need their permission to do this hacking. So you get it in writing, make sure they're aware, and at that point, you also, because if you want to test your incident response plan, you want to make sure they're aware of what you're going to do and make sure they don't tell their security operation teams of what's going on, because you want to be able to test whether or not they actually see you doing this. You also need a communications plan or notification plan in place, because eventually, once this pen test takes place and we start executing on the ethical hacking, or the ethical hacker starts doing that, there's going to be some lights going on, and you don't want to escalate that to a higher level. You want to stop it once you know it's you or you doing the actual pen test. So you don't want to go through a full-blown incident response plan when you know it's you. You want to check to see if the tools work and people are actually paying attention to those tools and start escalation, but not actually escalate. Finally, or not finally, I'm sorry. In the next stage, it's reconnaissance. So the ethical hacker will sit down and gather some information from you, and then they're going to do their own reconnaissance, just like a hacker would. They're going to try to discover everything about you and the organization and your network. And the reason why they want to do this is there could be potential blind spots that you're not aware of, because this is really how an attacker will do it. They're going to do the same thing. Is there something you don't know about your network? You think you plugged that hole, but you didn't. They're going to find it and try to execute on that. The next phase is testing. So they're going to go out there and identify the vulnerabilities. They're going to try to exploit those vulnerabilities. So it's important that you so they're going to go through the exploitation. Once they do the exploitation, that's when you're going to start seeing your incident response plan kicking in or not kicking in, and that's an important piece of this. Again, I'm a firm believer in testing my entire program, including my incident response plan, so I would want them to do that. Finally, the last stage of it is the post-testing. This is where you're going to go through the results. You're going to analyze it. You're going to see what the attack vectors are, because it's important to see what those attack vectors are, because those are your threats coming in. And then you're going to do some kind of prioritized remediation of those threats. And it may take you a period of time to do this, but it's well worth the effort. So in conclusion, I recommend security by design. From a standpoint of it's cheaper to do it, it's easier time to market, and it's going to reduce your frequency and severity of breaches. You don't want to put critical business systems into production without some kind of security testing to make sure they are doing that. And that becomes a process in it by itself. Every time you go to release something, you're testing it before it goes and getting that sign-off. And then finally, perform regular vulnerability scans, or if you have continuous monitoring in place, that is better. But if you don't, you want to perform regular vulnerability scans. Remember here is if you're doing it according to law, you can do it biannual. But if you're doing it biannual, you're going 6 months with vulnerabilities that you don't know you had or could have had. So more frequently, the better, and that's why they kind of lean towards continuous monitoring. Require security training as part of security skills training. Important across the entire organization. Everybody should be trained on security so that humans are the weakest link. And also on the IT side, people need to understand if they're configuring a system, they're writing code, they need to bake security into the process. And finally, assess your overall security before an attacker does. And again, this is where penetration testing comes in. I rather somebody else come in, check it, and give me a clean bill of health than finding out through an attack. So with that, I will turn it over to Brittany to talk a little bit about Sphere.
Michael, thank you for a great presentation. Just a reminder, we urge you to send in your questions. And while we wait for them to come in, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Sphere Technology Solutions. So we are a cybersecurity company. We have built a niche focusing on protecting your most sensitive data. We find it, we secure it, and provide all the mechanisms to manage data security long term. We work with the largest and most complex firms in the world, which has allowed us to grow over 600% over the last 4 years. So how do we do it? Well, we could start with an assessment. We look at different platforms in your organization, like your file shares, SharePoint, Active Directory, and many more. After deciding on your target environment, we focus on multiple areas, including unstructured data, privileged access management, and identity access management. This can also be regulation-driven, where we focus on allowing you to meet regulatory compliance requirements, like New York Department of Financial Services, General Data Protection Regulations, and others. After understanding your needs, we create a target operating model specifically built for your organization, which is what we call a risk prioritized plan on what we should remediate. When we talk about policies, you can't help but worry about your risk. You are here because of that concern and the implementation of the New York Department of Financial Services cybersecurity requirements. To reduce your risk and assist with compliance, we offer CISO advisory and CISO on-demand services to achieve your cybersecurity needs. As part of an overall cybersecurity program and to comply with the New York Department of Financial Services cybersecurity requirements, you need to ensure that you remediate the risks that you have identified in your risk assessment. This includes, but is not limited to, addressing the core components of your identity and access management strategy and establishing the right data governance. Sphere's extensive experience and expertise in the remediation of these critical gaps that potentially exist in your environment. To illustrate this, we have successfully completed projects around unstructured data, Active Directory, and many more. We utilize our product Sphere Board, which provides visibility to the ongoing risks with access to your sensitive data. I want you to look at these two success stories. Today, we are going to focus on the project we completed around privileged access management. This global financial firm had 30,000 instances of administrative access for 700 database servers. Now, to give you a little background, this organization had zero visibility into privileged accounts. And as Michael has mentioned many times in previous webinars, if you do not know who has the keys to the kingdom, you are putting your organization at risk. This client reached out to us because not only did they lack visibility, but the accounts were just not managed properly. We completed an analysis to provide visibility and identify where they were most at risk. This client was already using a solution called CyberArk to manage a portion of their privileged accounts. We completed a gap analysis using the information in CyberArk against what was not. We discovered those accounts that only needed privileged access and then continued using CyberArk to ensure that these accounts would be managed properly as an ongoing life cycle. To hear more about our success stories, please feel free to contact us. Now, enough about Sphere. I'm going to pass it over to George to answer your questions.
Brittany, thank you very much for providing us with that overview of Sphere. And thank you very much to Mike Mihalik for providing us with some insightful information on the DFS cybersecurity rules. We have some questions coming in to the thing, and I urge you to send us your questions using the dialog box that you see. They will be answered sequentially in the order in which they were received. And so the first question that's coming in centers around something that actually is from my heart. So in case it's in case you don't know my background, I actually come from a long line of IT consulting companies. My last thing before cybersecurity was in application development. And this organization has a lot of developers in their business units. The question is, how do I get them to adhere to a security by design standard, and how do I monitor and enforce this? Like, considering my background, that actually, tugs into what the life I had before cybersecurity and spheres. So I'd love to hear your insight into this.
Sure. Thanks, George. That's a great question. It really comes down from the tone from the top. This is an organizational requirement, then everybody will follow it. So if senior management is dictating that we're going to go through application security practices and they're putting a policy in place, then the whole organization is going to be governed by that policy and procedure. So regardless of what department you may fall into, whether it be IT or on the business side, you'll be following that process. And you'll be using some of the tools that IT is already using and leveraging that. That would be the cheapest and most effective way. But the organization is actually which is driving the direction in which the senior manager will be driving the direction in which the organizations go.
And you raise a good point, because it really comes from the top down. As application developers, sometimes they don't necessarily think about security versus making the next milestone in what they're putting in place. So you're saying that application security should be first and foremost in that whole scheme of things.
Well, I'm saying risk management is
risk management.
Risk management. It starts at senior management decides what risk the organization is going to undertake, and so we talked a little bit about that in our previous webinars. Is senior management, the board of directors, or some other governing body is deciding what the risk tolerance is of the organization and whether they're going to treat risk or not. So having visibility to this as a risk, the organization can then dictate what that policy would be, or if they're going to accept that risk, right? And that then filters down through the organization.
Great. So we have another question coming in, and it centers around an organization that has a number of applications. I assume they're homegrown and commercial off the shelf, modifiable off the shelf. Question is, do I need to perform application security assessments on all of my applications? I've done this for all the tier 1 applications, and I think this goes back to the uncertainty some people think about the cybersecurity requirements. People don't necessarily know which direction to go to, and application security is definitely one area.
So let's use a scenario to try to answer this one. So if you have an application installed on a desktop, and I've done some reconnaissance as an attacker, and I find out that you're using that application in your environment, I send out a phishing scam. And that person actually clicks on that phishing scam, which then launches the attack on that software. I may be able to get into your environment. So, yes, the answer to the question is you should do a vulnerability scan across your entire environment, and then from that perspective, handle the vulnerabilities based on the risk they pose to the organization.
Great stuff. We do have time for one final question, but you can still send us your questions if we can fit it in the next few seconds. So please feel free. But again, we have this one last one coming in, and it's a very simple question. How frequently should I perform a pen test?
So my recommendation is at least annually. And again, it depends on your environment. If your environment is changing constantly, I would do it more frequently. If your PCI requirements, right, that dictates a more frequent pen test. So you've got to look at everything in a whole. What am I being governed by? Is my environment constantly changing? And then make that decision of how often I need to do that pen test.
Great. With that said, I think that is all the questions we have for this afternoon. With that said, I'd like to thank Mike Mahalik and Brittany Pimpinella once again. A recording of this webinar will be posted on our website at www.sphereco.com. Again, that's www.sphereco.com. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon. Bye for now.